Hello, everybody. It's Scott Bunce again. And today I'm here with Chip Espinoza. And Chip has been a Vistage speaker at my group. And I was really impressed about his topic of dealing with millennials. Chip is an author. Chip's written 3 books. And I think he's got a lot to share around millennials. And with that, Chip, welcome. I'm glad you could be with us today.
Thanks, Scott. Good. My pleasure. Had a great time speaking to your group a couple of years ago, I think it's been now. But yeah, absolutely.
Well, that means you've probably learned that much more about how to deal with millennials. And, frankly, I would love to hear more about it. Being a man of gray hair myself, sometimes millennials, their behavior goes right over my head. And I know it was helpful when I heard from you before, but tell us a little bit about millennials. I know you've done research. Tell us a little bit about your research and what you know.
Well, I got interested in the subject matter. I'm a university professor, and I noticed a difference between my students who were Gen X and when it transitioned to millennials. And now really Z, there's some similarities that are there as well. And the difference that I saw was that on the first day of class orientation, if you gave out a syllabus, Gen X would grab it, throw it in their backpack, and just not ask questions about it. They'd just go do it. With the millennials and this younger generation, it's like they'd raise their hand and is 10 to 12 page paper an A? How many classes can I miss and get an A? And so what I realized is that they came in with a notion that everything was negotiable. And that's a game changer for some people in the way that they manage, is that they take an affront to that. So I got interested in the subject matter simply by watching my students, but then I had clients as well that it just seemed to me like I kept getting complaints over and over and over again saying, I don't understand this generation. I don't understand this generation. And so I thought, well, this is worth looking at and doing research. And so my first book was Managing the Millennials, which really was about how they were perceived in the workplace by management. And there were 2 groups of managers that emerged from the research. One that was effective at managing young professionals, and the other that was challenged. And so my hypothesis was, well, the ones that are good at it see them in a different light than the ones who are challenged. But that turned out not to be true. It's how they responded to what they were seeing is what defined whether they belonged in the good group or in the challenge group. And so I also had some hypotheses women would be better than men at doing it because of a nurturing component, but that turned out not to be true. I thought perhaps parents of that generation would be better at managing them, but the opposite turned out to be true on that one. And so as I looked at it, a lot of the challenges that are created in the workforce may or may not be reality. In other words, just because somebody's young doesn't mean they're a certain way. But when they're perceived in a certain light and that perception is acted upon, then you create a reality for people. So
are you saying it could be the manager themselves and maybe not the millennial that's causing the problem unknown all along?
Yeah, because it's really about trying to understand them. And if you think about it, a lot of us, our only framework is from our own experience. And so this is the way I did it coming up, or this is the way that I saw it done. This is how my boss treated me. And that doesn't always work in this sense of managers finding that they have to adapt to a changing workforce. And so when I say young professional, we're not looking at a whole lot of Gen Z yet in the workforce, particularly in professional positions. And so what I'm saying, really, a lot of the perceptions drive the reality for Gen Z as well. And so whether they're actually that way or not, if they're perceived that way. And so my work basically is to start out with, I thought, well, what's the best way to tackle this challenge?
Mhm.
And I thought by training managers and leadership on how to better understand young professionals. And so I got into that and created training programs for companies and did keynoting, worked with their managers. And then I started getting asked the question by different leaders saying, well, you're telling us what we have to do. What do they need to do to be effective?
Mhm.
And so by then I was doing a lot of international work for some multinational companies, and I had access all over the world to young professionals. So I created a study where I took somebody who had been in career 4 years or less, and then looked at what did they perceive their challenges to be. And then I came up with a skill set that they could overcome those challenges with. And what was fascinating about it to me, some of it was easy to figure out. You know, the number one thing that challenged them was their lack of experience.
Mm.
And not necessarily that they know it themselves, but it was thrown in their face anytime they wanted to get the job or they wanted a promotion or those kinds of things. And so what I did is I said, okay, I taught managers about young professionals, and I taught young professionals about how they're perceived in the workplace and what to do about it. And then the third book, I think, probably is the most pertinent when it comes to millennials right now. And that's really about emerging leaders, those that are taking on more responsibility in management and leadership roles. And so to look at, well, what were the challenges you faced when you transitioned into management? And then, of course, wrote a book on, you know, how to lead and those kinds of things. So that's kind of the catalyst for it all. And it just kind of exploded because I think I was in the right place at the right time with the right subject matter,
Mhm.
where, and a lot of people projected the conversation maybe to be a 4 to 5 year conversation, but I mean, we're coming up almost on 20 years
Mm.
of this interest. And part of it is because millennials make up the majority of the workforce now. And so whatever is going on with them is going to draw the attention of everybody. And so where I think it comes into play, particularly the third book, for the people that you lead or work with, is succession planning.
Mhm.
How do we how do we how do we help that next generation usher into leadership, and what do we need to do to see that happen? And so that's really kind of the whole thing. And it's just, you know, like I said, I've had the opportunity to work for governments, travel the world, and it's really not that difficult in the sense that it makes sense that you just seek to understand someone else. I think it was Covey's principle.
Yeah, seek first to understand and then be understood.
Right. And I think that's critical when it comes to managing a younger generation.
Right. So when you, I know you're an author and you're a speaker, but do you ever go into an organization, then spend specific time with an older generation, and then tailor your presentation to the millennials themselves, or do you just attack it separately? Is there ever a time where you're going into a company and doing both, or how do
Well,
you do that?
it's interesting because in some cases I'll do both. And that's probably where I think I find my work the most satisfying, because a lot of young professionals think, oh, great, here we go again. They're going to bash my generation. And when they get in there and they start to hear about the research and about the perceptions and those, all of a sudden, they go, that's not what I thought it was going to be at all.
Mhm.
And so, and then, the older generations having aha moments that said, I get it now. I was speaking at a top 100 conference for a large corporation. And there was a guy that was a skeptic in there in the beginning. And you could just, a couple of his questions were kind of tipped his hand a little bit. And at the end, he got up in front of everybody, all the young professionals and his peers, and said, I've been wrong in the way that I've approached this, and I need to change. And so I think that's the most critical thing for today's leaders, is that we have the ability to adapt. But it's one thing to have the ability to adapt. It's another thing to know what to do when you're adapting. And so in some cases, I have everybody together, but I also tackle it separately when it comes to a training perspective, because they're two totally, it's the same conversation, it's just through a different lens.
Right.
And so, like I was sharing to that young professional, I'll help them understand their managers better. I'll help the managers understand the young professionals better. So I go in, and it just depends on what a company wants. If they want their own trainers to do it, then I work with their trainers and to get them up to speed and knowledgeable about the material. But for the most part, a lot of companies start with the whole group together.
Mm-hmm.
Or I shouldn't say the whole group together. They start, usually I work with an executive team, because somebody's feeling pain somewhere.
Right.
And they want to hear about it, and they want to know what to do about it. And that's one of my things about this subject matter is it's a pet peeve that I have, is that a lot of people talk about what do they like to wear, what do they like to eat, do they like cereal, do they, all that stuff doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that, can we create environments where everyone can thrive?
Mm-hmm.
And so working with leadership teams is very gratifying, because that's where you really have to have the buy-in. The buy-in from the perspective of saying, we're committed to this, we believe it's a challenge, and we're going to put resource toward it. And I think that you could talk about it till you're blue in the face, but until you put resource behind it, or some sense of structure of an approach, then nothing's going to change.
What are the top 3 things that an older generation does wrong as it relates to the millennials?
I think the top one is what I said a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It's where they're comparing that generation to their own experience and using themselves kind of is the blueprint for how they lead. And it's a very different world. I mean, if you think about the major influence in life, influences would be family, would be school, education system, and then just social constructs as a whole. So the world that they're growing up in is very different than the world that previous generations grew up in.
Mhm.
And I'll give you an example on the parenting side is that, to use myself as an example, if you forgot your baseball glove for practice, then you didn't play with a glove or you had to borrow somebody's glove. But nobody was driving me home to get the glove so that I could have it. That would be unheard of today. I mean, it's just like we live near a high school and I see just a line of parents handing cleats over, gloves over, pads over. And so we have a generation of parent that was the parent of the millennials, basically, which is the baby boomer generation, that they didn't hear 3 words when they were growing up. And they were, I love you. And so what they committed to do is to say, my kid's going to know I love them.
Mhm.
And so the pendulum kind of went, swung pretty radically to what parenting styles were prior to the millennials, to what they became with the millennials. As a college professor, it's not uncommon for parents to call me about people's grades, even though by law I can't share anything,
Mhm.
or to try to talk me into, we want to go to Europe for 3 weeks and we don't want her to have to do any work.
Mm.
So that's a little bit of the difference. And that's where that mindset, I think, of that young professional, they come by it honestly, is that authority figures are there to support me and help me get where I want to go. And so another aspect of the manager that doesn't understand that development is their love language is probably going to fail.
Mm.
And so by recognizing to say, we have got to show value to this employee by showing how we're going to develop them.
Mhm.
And so in many ways, previous generations, they didn't have a guarantee about, if they work overseas for 6 months, if they're going to get promoted into partnership. They did it with the hopes that they would be. Today, it's kind of like, well, I'm not going over there unless I know that I'm going to get the prize at the end. And so that's another thing that I think managers get wrong, is that they're not proactive in the development of their younger employees. They're sitting back and just comparing them to their own experience. And I would say the third thing is this inability to try to understand the dynamics that are at play. There's a term, I wish I'd have come up with it. If I had a rock band, this is what I would name it: demographic metabolism. And Norman Ryder out of the University of Nebraska came up with it like in 1965. And demographic metabolism is where younger generations are taking the place of older generations
Mhm.
in the leadership of our institutions. And his point was, nothing's going to change that. It's going to happen whether you want it to or not. And so my message a lot of time with leadership is, this is going to happen, and whether you want it to or not. And so to put your head in the sand and say it's their issue, their problem, is really counterproductive to the future of that organization, its vitality, its sustainability, those kinds of things.
So what I'm hearing, Chip, is that millennials want to do a good job. They want to work hard, but their expectation is somebody's going to mentor them, will pour into them to help make them successful. It's no longer throwing somebody in to sink or swim. Their love language again is your involvement in their world and their growth.
Absolutely. And if you think about it, Gen X, they had files thrown at them and say, go figure it out. And then they did. They're a highly independent generation. And so when they try that with a younger professional, it just doesn't fly for that very reason.
Mhm.
And I think that you have to show your concern about them as a person, concern for their future, how they're being developed, and have those conversations regularly or more frequently. A lot of the times, the only time they hear from us is when something goes wrong and not when it's going right. And and so I think they really respond to affirmation, but
Mhm.
not just empty affirmation. It has to be substantive. And so, but yeah, absolutely.
So Chip, we're running out of time here. I love what you're saying because it even though I've heard your message before, getting it reinforced is important to me. Can you do a few things? Can you tell us the name of your 3 books? And if somebody is interested in hearing from you directly, or maybe wants you to work with their organization, how do they get a hold of you?
Okay, so Chip at chipespinoza.com.
Mhm.
And on that site, there's contact information. Also, there's an online learning course. So if you have HR people and you go, I want them to know more about this before we go any further, they can sign up for that course
Mhm.
and take it. And then the third thing is I wrote Managing the Millennials, then Millennials at Work, and then Millennials Who Manage. And those are all available, online, and not so much in brick and mortar anymore. It has to be ordered, but it's available on Amazon.
Great. Well, Chip, again, fascinating topic. I'm glad you were able to go into a little depth with us today. And now that people know how to get a hold of you, I hope they take advantage of your knowledge and all of your research. So thanks again, Chip. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Scott, for having me, and I wish you the best.
Thanks.